What's up, family? So we're going to read Donald Trump post. It says Hakeem Jeffries, a low IQ individual, said our Supreme Court is quote unquote illegitimate. After saying such a thing, isn't he subject to impeachment? I got impeached for a perfect phone call. Where are you Republicans? Why not get it started? They'll be doing this to me, President Donald J. Trump. Now, family, this leads to me saying the thing that should concern every American right now. It's not just one politician attacking another politician. That happens every single day. The bigger issue is when elected leaders start telling the public that the institutions they do not control are illegitimate, corrupt, rigged, or part of some scheme. And then they act shocked when the country becomes more divided, more angry, and more unstable. That is what this story is really about. Right now, the internet is reacting to comments involving Hakeem Jeffries, President Trump, the Supreme Court, voting rights, court expansion, non-citizen voting, and the direction the country could be heading politically. And regardless of whether you are Republican, Democrat, Independent, Conservative, Liberal, or somewhere in the middle, there is a serious conversation that needs to happen here about political rhetoric, constitutional order, and how far leaders are willing to go when they do not get the outcomes they want. Because this is bigger than one speech. This is bigger than one court ruling. This is bigger than one social media post. This is about the way powerful people talk to the country when they lose power, when they lose a case, when the courts do not rule their way, or when they believe the next election is their chance to fundamentally reshape the system. And let me be very clear from the beginning. Criticizing the Supreme Court is allowed. Criticizing politicians is allowed. Criticizing the government is allowed. And that is part of the First Amendment. That is part of being an American. And I'm not sitting here saying that any court, any president, any member of Congress, or any political party should be immune from criticism. Absolutely not. The founders did not create a country where citizens had to sit down, shut up, and blindly trust whoever happened to be in power. But there is a difference between saying I disagree with this decision and saying the court itself is illegitimate. There is a difference between saying I think the justices got it wrong and telling people that the court is part of a scheme to rig elections or cheat the public. Because once leaders start convincing people that every institution they do not control is illegitimate, the next question becomes obvious. What are their supporters supposed to do with that belief? That is where the danger is. We have seen over the last several years how fast political rhetoric can turn into real world consequences. We have seen threats against public officials. We have seen protests get out of control. And we've seen political violence become something people try to excuse when it comes from their side. And that is wrong no matter who does it. And it is wrong when it comes from the right, and it's wrong when it comes from the left. And we're going to have a country. If we're going to have a country, then we have to be honest enough to call it out consistently. Now, in this clip, we're about to look at Hakeem Jeffries is going after the Supreme Court in a very aggressive way. He is not just saying he disagrees with the ruling, he is framing the court as illegitimate. He is framing the decision as an attack on voting rights, and he is saying that this is not really the Roberts court, it is the Trump court. And then he goes even further by suggesting that Republicans aided by the court are trying to suppress the vote, rig the midterm elections, and cheat to win. And that is a serious accusation. And this is where I want people to slow down and actually think, because you can disagree with the Supreme Court, you can dislike the current makeup of the court, and you can believe Congress should pass new laws. You can support changes to voting law. But when the language becomes illegitimate, rigged, cheating, and everything is on the table, then we are no longer just having a policy debate. We're having a conversation about whether one side is preparing the public to reject the system unless they control it. And that matters because the Supreme Court is not supposed to be popular. It's not supposed to be a polling organization, and it's not supposed to bend to whoever is trending on social media that day. The entire point of having a constitutional republic is that some rights and some limits on government exist beyond temporary political passion. That is why we have separation of powers. That is why we have checks and balances. And that is why the founders did not create a pure democracy where 51% of the country can wake up tomorrow and vote away your speech or vote away your gun rights, your property rights, your due process, or your ability to worship freely. So when leaders start attacking the court as illegitimate simply because they do not like the decision, that is not a small thing. That is not just a campaign talk. That is a message to the public that the referee only counts when their team wins. And that is exactly what we need to talk about today. So hit the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and I want you guys to check this out.
Decision by this illegitimate Supreme Court majority. strikes a blow against the Voting Rights Act and is designed to undermine the ability of communities of color all across this country to elect their candidate of choice. But we're not here to step back, we're here to fight back.
Yes.
Now, when this decision came out earlier today, it's an unacceptable decision, but not an unexpected decision. Because this isn't even really the Roberts Court. It's the Trump Court.
Yes.
And what we would expect from the Trump Court is an effort to continue their scheme to suppress the vote and rig the midterm elections and beyond. Because these extremists have failed America in every possible way. They failed on the economy, they failed on health care, they're failing as it relates to this reckless and costly war of choice. The extremists have completely and totally failed America.
That's right.
So they've concluded, aided and abetted by the Trump court, that they have to cheat to win.
Yes.
But the reality of our experience, our journey, now more than 400 years, is that we view a setback, and this is one, but we view setbacks as nothing more than a setup for a comeback.
So you heard what was said in that clip. Hakeem Jeffries calls the Supreme Court majority illegitimate. He says the decision strikes a blow against the Voting Rights Act. He says the court is designed to undermine communities of color. And then he says this is not really the Roberts Court, it's the Trump Court. And then he takes it further by saying there is an effort to suppress the vote, rig the midterm elections, and cheat to win. Now let's break this down like adults, because this is where political commentary usually go off the rails. One side hears that and says he is defending democracy. The other side hears it and says he is attacking the court. But the bigger question is this: what exactly is being argued, and why are the consequences of that? What are the consequences of that argument? When Democrats talk about voting rights, they usually frame the issue around access. Their argument is that certain election rules, district maps, voter ID laws, registration requirements, or court rulings can make it harder for certain communities to have political representation. That is the argument they are making. And historically, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was one of the major civil rights laws in American history. It was passed to stop discriminatory practices that had been used to keep Black Americans from voting, especially in the South. That history is real. Nobody serious should pretend it did not happen, but here's where the debate changes. The question today is not whether discrimination existed in American history. It did. The question is whether every modern election law Republicans support is automatically voter suppression. The question is whether every court decision Democrats dislike is automatically racist, illegitimate, or corrupt. The question is whether disagreement over voting rules means one side is trying to destroy democracy. That is where I have a serious problem with the rhetoric. Because in a constitutional system, courts are allowed to interpret the law differently than politicians want them to. That is the whole point. If the Supreme Court only exists to rubber stamp whatever Congress, the president, or activist groups demand, then it's not really a court anymore. It's just another political committee wearing robes. And this is not new. Every side gets frustrated with the court when it loses. Conservatives have been angry at Supreme Court decisions before. Liberals have been angry at Supreme Court decisions before. That is normal. What is not normal is the constant escalation where every loss becomes proof that the system itself is illegitimate. That word matters, illegitimate. Because once you call the court illegitimate, you're not just criticizing the legal reasoning. You're not questioning whether people should respect the institution at all. And you are questioning whether the people should respect the institution at all. And if the institution is illegitimate, then what comes next? Do you ignore the rulings? Do you pack the court? Do you threaten the justices? Because to me, it goes into line of actually justifying what Trump is saying in regards of going however far you want to go, even to the point that you would disrespect the law and the highest court of the law of the land in the judicial system, just to turn around and call it illegitimate because it's not working in your favor, let alone the border being open from the Biden administration that Trump had been touting and letting illegals in out of disrespect to Americans, because every illegal that was accounted for to vote due to mail-in ballots, due to not having voter ID, discredited another American vote or a legal immigrant who came in here the right way and came into America the right way, who actually voted and went through the process to come in here and to come into the country the right way. So the illegal is discrediting the legal immigrant vote, let alone the American vote as well, for every illegal that have access to vote, which then turns into, okay, well, I'm willing to disrespect the Supreme Court on top of disrespecting the laws when it comes to national security, allowing the illegals to uphold power. I'm just having a conversation, family. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just throwing things out there in regards of questioning, or I mean, as questions to get the juices flowing for you to think for yourself as I show you guys the evidence in which the rhetoric that has been spoken as we go along the line during this video. And if you like this video and got value from this video, give this video a big thumbs up. But this is why President Trump's response is getting attention. From the legal standpoint, when he mentions the illegals and how many illegals came into the country illegally with the border being open, but then also his point right here when it says Hakeem Jeffries is low IQ. Hakeem Jeffries, a low IQ individual, said our Supreme Court is illegitimate. That's why I read the post in the beginning of this video. Trump is saying in his own very direct way that if a Republican has something similar, the media and Democrats will treat it as dangerous, extreme, or disqualifying. And there is a real double standard conversation to be had there. Because for years, we were told that political rhetoric matters. We were told that words can incite. We were told that questioning institutions is dangerous. And we were told that public officials have a responsibility to lower the temperature. Okay, if that standard is real, then it has to apply to everybody. It cannot apply when the speaker is on the right. Only apply when the speaker is on the right. It cannot apply when the target is a Democrat priority. It cannot only apply when cable news decides is useful. If political rhetoric matters, then it matters when a top Democrat says the Supreme Court is illegitimate and suggests the court is helping one party cheat to win elections. Now, does that mean nobody can criticize the court? No. Again, criticize away. That is America. But there is a responsible way to do it. You could say, I think the court misread the Voting Rights Act. You could say, I think Congress should update the law. You could say, I think the ruling would have negative effects. That is a normal argument. But when you start calling the court illegitimate and saying the other side is cheating to win, you are not just explaining policy anymore. You are feeding distrust. And I know a lot of people would say, and the Republicans side has a responsibility too, because it is not enough to complain on social media. It is not enough to wait until the next election. If Republicans believe the constitutional order is being attacked, then they have to be able to explain clearly what they are defending, right? If Trump feels as though, look, they cheated the election, let the proof come out with Tuskegee Gabber and stuff like that. We know about a month or two ago, they were getting all of the votes and raiding the voting center over there in Fulton County in Atlanta, Georgia, or over there in Atlanta to look at the 2024 election ish to see what happened. 2024 election ish, yeah. So my whole point is defend it then. Substantiate your point with facts, not just slogans, not just outrage from both sides. And they need to explain why separation of powers matter. They need to explain why the court matters. And they need to explain why citizenship matters in voting. And they need to explain why expanding the court for partisan reasons would be a dangerous precedent. That is what frustrates a lot of people. Voters see the left organizing, messaging, pushing, protesting, fundraising, going on offense, and then look at Republicans and wonder, what exactly are you doing? Because complaining is not a strategy. Posting is not a strategy. Fundraising off the problem and then refusing to fight the policy battle is not a strategy. And when Trump says Republicans need to wake up, that is what a lot of the base hears. They hear him saying, stop acting like this is normal politics, because the concern is that Democrats are not just criticizing one ruling. The concern is that some on the left are openly talking about changing the structure of power itself, adding states. For example, like we'll get into it with James Carville right here when it comes to adding states like Puerto Rico as the 51st state to have more seats to uphold power. You know, expanding the Supreme Court, weakening traditional limits, changing voting rules. and then acting like anyone who questions it is attacking democracy. That is the real issue. So now, I want you guys to hear what Hakeem Jeffries had to say as well. Again,
the guy's falling apart. The MAGA majorities in Congress are falling apart. The Supreme Court is a disgrace. And Ben, in the new Congress, we're going to have to do something about this Supreme Court. And let me be very clear. Everything is on the table. Everything to deal with this corrupt MAGA majority that is issuing political opinions that are designed to bolster the prospects of the Republican Party, and we will not allow them to succeed.
Heard my.
In the new Congress, we're going to have to do something about.
there you have it, family. So he said it. And this is the top Democrat political consultant and campaign strategist, James Carville, just stated on the left wing Politicon podcast that when the Democrats regain power, they plan to grant statehood to Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico so that Democrats can elect 4 extra seats in the Senate. Pack the U.S. Supreme Court from 9 justices up to 13 justices, added another 4 left wing justices to the court. Reopen the U.S. Mexican border and grant mass amnesty to every single alien currently inside the United States. His advice to the Democrat politicians: don't run on it, don't talk about it, just do it. So, the simple fact is the greed of power, man. The greed of power, let alone discrediting and the disrespect to the taxpayers, those who came and done things the right way, and it just tells you how they don't care about the ruling or the laws of the land. Now let's go deeper because this is where people need the historical and constitutional context. The United States was designed with tension built into the system. The founders did not trust concentrated power. They did not trust kings. They did not trust mobs. They did not trust temporary majorities. And honestly, they did not even fully trust politicians, which was smart because politicians spent the last 200 plus years proving why that distrust was necessary for things like this that we just read. That is why power was divided. Congress writes laws, the president enforces laws, the courts interpret laws, the states have their own authority. The people have rights that government is not supposed to violate. That structure is not perfect, but it was designed to slow down power. It was designed to make it difficult for one faction to take over everything all at once. That is why the Supreme Court matters, not because the justices are perfect, they are not, not because every decision is right, it is not, but because without an independent judiciary, your rights become dependent on whoever controls Congress and the White House at the moment. And you see what they're supposedly planning to do, allegedly, right? So conservatives understand this very clearly when it comes to the Second Amendment. Look at District of Columbia v. Heller in 2008. The Supreme Court recognized that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms, especially for lawful purposes like self-defense in the home. Then in McDonald v. Chicago in 2010, the court applied that protection against state and local governments. Then in New York, State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin in 2022. The court said gun restrictions have to be judged by the text of the Second Amendment in the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Now, you may ask, what does that have to do with the Supreme Court debate? Everything. Because the same people who say courts should protect voting rights will often turn around and act like the court should not protect gun rights. The same people who want judges to aggressively defend rights they care about sometimes want those same judges to step aside when it comes to rights they dislike. But constitutional rights do not work that way. The First Amendment does not only only protect speech you agree with. The Second Amendment does not only protect people with popular opinions. Due process does not only apply when the defendant is politically convenient. Equal protection does not only matter when your side benefits. That is the whole point of constitutional government. Now let's talk about the court packing, because that phrase gets thrown around a lot. The Constitution does not set the number of Supreme Court justices at 9. Congress has changed the size of the court before in American history. So technically, Congress can change the number, but the reason court packing is controversial is not because it is impossible legally. It is controversial because it became a way for one party to change the rules when it does not like the current court. The most famous example is Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1937. After the Supreme Court struck down parts of his New Deal agenda, FDR supported a plan that would have allowed him to add more justices. The public debate was intense, and even many Democrats were uncomfortable with it because it looked like an attempt to pressure the court and change its composition for political reasons. The plan failed, but the warning remained. Once one party expands the court to get the outcomes it wants, the other party can do the same thing when it gets power. And that creates a cycle with no obvious stopping point. Today it's 9 justices. One party says make it 13. Then the other party gets power and says make it 15. Then the next party says make it 19. At some point, the Supreme Court stops looking like a court and starts looking like a super legislator where the size changes depending on who wins the last election. That is not stability. That is institutional arms race politics. Now, supporters of expanding the court argue that the current court is already political. They argue that the confirmation process has become partisan. They argue that Republican presidents appointed several conservative justices and that Democrats need to rebalance the institution. That is their argument. But even if someone understands that frustration, the question is whether the cure is worse than the disease. Because if every controversial court majority becomes an excuse to expand the court, then the court's independence is basically gone. And this connects directly to the language we heard in the clip. When a leader calls the court illegitimate and then says everything is on the table, people hear that as a signal. Maybe the signal is court expansion. Maybe there's jurisdiction stripping. Maybe it's ethics investigations. Maybe it's some other structural change. But the message is clear. This court is not acceptable, and if we regain power, we may do something major to it. That's what Hakeem Jeffries just said, family. That's what he said here. That is why voters need to pay attention. Now, let's talk about non-citizen voting, because this is another issue that creates a lot of confusion. I want you guys to hear this out for yourself, and then we get into it right here, right now, of course.
Meantime, now to our other top story here at 3. Local leaders pushing a proposal that would allow non-citizens to vote in LA city elections. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Annabelle Sedano. LA mayoral candidates are now weighing in on that plan. Let's go to NBC4's Karma Dickerson. She's live in downtown LA outside City Hall with a breakdown of this proposal. Karma.
Well, Annabelle, we do want to reiterate the conversation surrounds voting in local elections. This would not apply to federal elections, and it still has a long way to go. Nevertheless, even though it was just introduced yesterday, it is already getting a lot of attention. People have many questions, so here's what you need to know. Currently, the city charter requires people voting in city elections to meet the voter eligibility requirements of the state of California, which is to be a U.S. citizen. However, Councilmember Hugo Soto Martinez, whose district includes Hollywood, Silver Lake, and Echo Park, introduced a motion to change the charter. The motion calls for amending the charter to allow the city council to expand voting to non-citizens for local elections like mayor and city council. He says it's too early to know if the proposal would include undocumented people as well as green card holders. He also says this proposal is about representation, but some opponents say voting is a right fundamentally reserved for Americans.
I certainly recognize that we have folks living in this country who've been here 20 years, they've started a family, they pay their taxes, many of them are homeowners, but they don't have a say over the policies that affect their children and their families on any given day. The motion only asks to seek to explore whether we want to head in that direction. I think the details of who's going to be involved, how we're going to do it, all that needs to get sussed out.
Generally speaking, though, most people still have this concept that the franchise ought to be limited to people who are full-fledged members of American society, and that certainly should not be extended to people who are in the country illegally.
And this proposal is far from a done deal. It now goes to the City Council Rules Committee. If passed out of committee, it would still need to clear approval by the entire City Council to go before voters on the November ballot. Voters would then be asked whether or not they want to give the City Council the ability to expand voting to non-citizens. If voters say yes, the City Council would then have to decide if they actually want to do this, if they actually want to allow non-citizens to vote in local elections. If they decide yes, they want to do that, then the mayor would have to sign off as well. And coming up at 5, we're going to dig more into the details of what is in this proposal.
There you have it, family. So now I know a lot of people, you better vote. You better wake up. You better vote. I'm not telling you what to vote, how to vote, what to think, but voting matters. And your local legislators. The local elections matter than the presidential. I mean, both matter, but your local, look, man, they shape your life even more. Your local elections, your mayors, your governors. But I say all that to say because a lot of individuals say, "Oh, well, my vote don't matters." Well, okay, you keep being ignorant, and now they're going to discredit your vote entirely, where your vote really won't matter. So, which one you want? For it to actually matter, you vote to stand up for it to protect it, or to be discredited and actually belittled or um minimized because of a vote of an individual who aren't supposed to be in the country in the first place, a non-citizen. Let me know what you think. But before we get to this, right, and I'm talking more about the non-citizen voting, something came to my mind as a solution for that whole revenge thing with the Supreme Court. Depending on whoever becomes president, they keep adding seats and things. I think they should make a law, or even better, a constitutional amendment that says neither party can change the number of Supreme Court seats unless both parties agree by a huge majority. That stops the Democrats or Republicans from adding judges every time they win power just to control the court to get what they want and pass what they want. Because if one side starts adding the seats, then the other side will do it back, and then the court turns into political warfare instead of an actual court. That's been my whole point earlier on. So I think lock the court at 9 seats permanently, where it's at, or require something like a 2/3 vote for Congress to add or remove seats. That forces compromise and prevents revenge politics, right? And then I think it should be term limits, like 18 years, so every president gets regular appointments instead of people freaking out over one lifetime seat for 40 years. Let me know what you guys think about that. I think that's the common sense middle ground take to it. No easy court packing, no no easy party control tricks, and less political panic, and more stability long term. Now, the non-citizen stuff, because this is another issue that creates a lot of confusion. Federal elections are different from local elections. Non-citizens cannot legally vote in federal elections. That is the law. But some local jurisdictions have debated or allowed non-citizens citizen voting in certain local elections, such as school board or municipal races, which I feel like is unfair to the American taxpayer and those who are here legally and sending their cows, their kid to school, their child to school. And you mean to tell me that a non-citizen is able to vote so they can benefit off the very things that you pay taxes for? And then you wonder why resources are so strained or so strenuous to be provided to the kids. But look, supporters argue that if people live in a community, pay taxes, send their kids to school, and are affected by local decisions, they should have some local voice. That is the argument for it with the non-citizen um, voting when local elections, the school board, or municipal races. But here's the argument against it, and this is a strong one. Voting is one of the core privileges and responsibilities of citizenship. Citizenship has to mean something. It's not an anti-immigrant. It is not anti-immigrant to say that. In fact, many immigrants who came here illegally followed the process, learned the history, took the oath, and became citizens. Understood that better than anyone. And they know citizenship is not just paperwork, it is a commitment to the country. So when a city says non-citizens should vote in local elections, a lot of Americans hear that and think, then what is the point of citizenship? Because local elections are not meaningless. City councils controlling policing priorities, housing rules, budget taxes, um, budget, zoning, public schools, and local regulations. Those decisions affect the direction of a city. And if you expand voting in those elections to people who are not citizens, then you are changing the political community itself. That deserves a serious debate, not name calling, not accusations, a serious debate. And yes, historically, there were places in early American history where non citizens could vote in certain elections. That is true. But history also shows that by the 20th century, the country moved strongly toward the idea that voting should be tied to citizenship. So when someone says this used to exist, that does not end the argument. A lot of things existed in the past. The real question is rather is it wise now under today's conditions with today's immigration system, today's political motivations or incentives, and today's level of distrust. That is where the public has every right to be skeptical or suspicious, because when people see open border rhetoric, mass immigration debates, sanctuary city policies, proposals for non-citizen voting, and then political strategists talking about how future power could be locked in, people connect the dots. And whether Democrats like it or not, that perception exists. Many voters believe the left is trying to change the electorate rather than persuade the electorate vote. That is a serious trust problem. Now, Democrats will respond by saying they're expanding democracy, protecting marginalized communities, and making government more representative. That is their position. But critics respond by saying democracy is not just maximizing the number of ballots. Democracy also depends on citizenship, consent, legal order, secure elections, and constitutional limits. And trust that the rules are not being manipulated for partisan advantage. And that is the key point. Trust. When trust collapses, everything collapses. People stop believing elections are fair, and people stop believing courts are neutral. People stop believing that laws mean anything. And you know what that means? An open door to the window effect of crime running rampant and lives being lost. Unfortunately, that don't have to. It'll people start thinking power is the only thing that matters. And once a country gets to that point, it's very hard to bring it back. That is why responsible leaders should be lowering the temperature, not pouring gasoline on it. They should be able to say, we strongly disagree with the court and we will pursue lawful remedies. They should be able to say, we oppose this decision, but we respect the constitutional system. They should be able to say, we want voting rights protected, but we also recognize the importance of citizenship and election integrity. But too often, that is not what we get. We get this escalation, we get illegitimate, we get rigged, we get cheating, we get everything is on the table. Hakeem Jeffries. And then when regular Americans react with alarm, they are told they are overreacting. People are not overreacting, they're paying attention. So here's the takeaway. The issue is not whether Hakeem Jeffries, President Trump, Republicans, Democrats, or anybody else has the right to criticize the Supreme Court. They do. We all do. The issue is rather political leaders are being honest with the public about the differences between disagreement and delegitimization. Because once you normalize the idea that any institution your side does not control is illegitimate, you're training people to reject the system unless they win. And that is not constitutional government. That is not civic responsibility. That is not how a stable republic survives. And again, this is not about being anti-immigrant. It is not about saying voters should never question government. It is not about saying the Supreme Court is above criticism. It's about common sense. Citizenship should matter. Courts should not be packed every time one side loses a case. Political leaders should not casually accuse institutions of helping people cheat unless they are prepared to back that up with serious evidence from both sides. And they got to show it. Goes back to trust, right? And Republicans, if they believe all of this is happening and need to do more than complaining, they need to show. So if they raided that voting center in Fulton County in Atlanta, hopefully they got the substantial evidence to back up what they did and why they did it, and the whole point of bringing all things together to make sense. They need to clearly explain the stakes and actually use the power voters gave them, because this is the broader trend people are noticing. When the left loses in the court, same voices attack the court. When they lose on the policy, they talk about changing the rules. When they struggle to persuade voters, some activists talk about expanding the electorate vote. When they do not like the constitutional limits, they call those limits outdated or illegitimate. And the concern many Americans have is simple. Are we still debating policy within the system, or are we watching the movement trying to redesign the system so it never has to lose again? That is the conversation. I think that is where conservatives, independents, and frankly, any honest liberal who still believes in constitutional order should be able to agree on one thing. The rules can not only matter when your side benefits. The Constitution cannot only matter when it gives you the answer you want. The Supreme Court cannot only be legitimate when it rules your way. Voting cannot just be treated like a tool for partisan advantage. Citizenship cannot be an empty label. Rights cannot be protected selectively. Because the moment we accept that, we are not defending democracy, we are just defending power. And that is why this story matters. And it's not just about one statement, it's about a mindset. It's about whether politicians believe they are servants of the constitutional system, or whether they believe the system is only valid when it serves them. Those are two very different things. So yes, criticize the court, criticize Trump, criticize Jeffries, criticize Republicans, criticize Democrats. That is all fair game. But do not pretend words do not matter. Do not spend years saying rhetoric is dangerous and then act like it's harmless when your side uses the most aggressive language possible. Do not tell the country the Supreme Court is illegitimate and then act surprised when people lose trust. Do not tell Americans that election rules are rigged and then claim you are the only defender of democracy. The country needs less manipulation and more honesty. It needs leaders who can lose a case without trying to burn down the institution. It needs voters who understand their rights well enough to defend them. It needs citizens who know the difference between reform and power grabs. And it needs people who are willing to say the same standard applies to everybody. That is where I land on this. I do not want a country where one party gets to change the rules every time it loses. I do not want a country where citizenship is treated like a minor technicality. I do not want a country where the Supreme Court becomes a political weapon for whichever side controls Congress. And I definitely do not want a country where leaders keep raising the temperature and then blame the ordinary Americans for noticing. So let me know what you think. Do you think this is just normal political rhetoric, or do you think the leaders are crossing the line when they call the Supreme Court illegitimate and start talking about major structural changes? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I want to hear from where you stand on this. And while you are down there, hit the like button, share this video with somebody who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, turn on your post notifications so you don't miss the next one. And we're going to keep watching what they say, what they do, and whether the people in power are actually defending the Constitution or just defending their own power. Now catch you in the next one. Let the love supersede the hate. As always, we're having a conversation. Peace.